Welcome to this audiobook experience. If you are listening in this moment, I invite you to pause and settle yourself. Find a quiet space, adjust your headphones, and let the outside world fade for a while. This time belongs to you. You are about to step into a profound exploration of the forces that shape your motivation, your attention, and your capacity for deep, meaningful living in an age that seems determined to pull you in every direction at once. The journey ahead is called Dopamine Detox, and what you will discover is not a collection of quick fixes or surface-level advice. It is an invitation to understand why so many of us feel simultaneously overstimulated and underfulfilled, why focus has become elusive, and why the very tools we reach for to feel better often leave us feeling more restless than before. By the time we reach the end, you may find that the way you see your own habits, your phone, and even your sense of drive has shifted in ways that feel both surprising and deeply personal. Consider for a moment what happens in the quiet spaces of your day. You finish a task or find yourself between activities, and almost without thinking, your hand moves toward your device. There is no dramatic crisis demanding your attention, yet something inside you resists the stillness. In that resistance lives a story most of us have come to accept as normal. Your brain, shaped by millions of years of evolution to seek information, connection, and reward, now lives inside an environment that delivers those things in constant, perfectly calibrated bursts. The result is not simply that you spend more time on screens. It is that your capacity to tolerate the absence of stimulation has quietly diminished, and with it, your ability to stay with the slower, more demanding pursuits that once gave life its texture and depth. This is not a failure of character. It is the predictable outcome of a system that has learned to speak directly to the oldest parts of your mind while bypassing the newer, more reflective ones. And the most unsettling part is how invisible the process has become. You may not feel controlled, yet your days unfold in patterns you did not consciously choose. A quiet recognition, a sense that something essential is slipping through your fingers even as you stay busy, is where our exploration begins. As we start to unpack this reality, we first need to see the larger environment in which it has taken root. The world around you is engaged in an unprecedented competition for your attention, and the battlefield is your screen. What was once a tool for communication and information has been transformed into a marketplace where your focus itself is the product being bought and sold. Technology did not merely make information more accessible. It turned attention into the most valuable commodity of our time. Every platform, every app, every notification is the result of deliberate design choices made by teams whose success depends on keeping you engaged for as long as possible. The hidden cost of this arrangement reveals itself not in sudden catastrophes, but in the gradual erosion of your ability to direct your own mind. You begin to notice that conversations feel thinner when part of your awareness is waiting for the next vibration. Creative work that once flowed now requires more effort to begin because the mind has grown accustomed to quicker, easier forms of stimulation. Even rest becomes strangely effortful when the default state is constant input. Consider the experience of Marcus, a marketing professional in his mid-30s who lives in a busy metropolitan area. A few years ago, Marcus could sit with a single project for an entire morning, moving through research, writing, and refinement with a steady rhythm that left him satisfied at the end of the day. Over time, however, the rhythm changed. His phone, always within reach, began to punctuate his work with small interruptions that felt harmless at first. A message from a colleague, a news alert, a quick glance at a social feed during a moment of mental transition. Each interruption carried a tiny spark of novelty, a brief sense that something important might be waiting. What Marcus did not immediately notice was how these micro moments accumulated. By midday, he would feel strangely fatigued, Not from the work itself, but from the constant context switching his brain had been performing. The projects that once brought him a sense of progress now competed with an invisible pressure to stay responsive, to keep up, to never miss the next thing. Marcus was not lazy. He was responding to an environment that rewarded constant availability more immediately than deep concentration. His story is not unusual. It is simply one visible example of a much larger pattern playing out across millions of lives. This pattern becomes even clearer when we examine what has come to be called the dopamine economy. Companies do not profit when you feel satisfied and put your device down. They profit when you keep returning, keep scrolling, keep watching. The business model depends on engagement, and engagement is engineered through an intimate understanding of how your brain responds to reward. The science behind endless scrolling is not mysterious. It rests on the brain's tendency to release dopamine not primarily when a reward arrives, but in anticipation of it. Each new piece of content in an infinite feed carries the possibility that it will be more interesting, more validating, or more novel than the last. That possibility is enough to keep the seeking system active. Social media platforms have refined this process to an extraordinary degree, using your own behavior data to predict what will hold your attention just a little longer. The exploitation is subtle but powerful. Features like variable timing of notifications, unpredictable like counts, and algorithmically curated feeds mirror the psychological structures that make gambling compelling. You are not simply consuming content. You are participating in a carefully calibrated loop that keeps your brain in a state of mild, persistent craving. Yet the addiction that emerges from this loop does not look like traditional substance addictions. There are no dramatic physical withdrawal symptoms in the way we associate with certain drugs. Instead, the dependency reveals itself in quieter ways. You may find yourself saying, "Just one more video," or "Just one more scroll," and then discovering that 30 minutes or an hour has disappeared. Entertainment, which once served as genuine relaxation, begins to function as a way to avoid the discomfort of your own thoughts or the effort of more demanding activities. The trap is not that these activities are inherently bad. It is that they have been designed to bypass your natural stopping mechanisms. When every experience is engineered to feel a little more compelling than the last, the ordinary texture of life starts to feel strangely flat by comparison. This brings us to one of the most puzzling and widespread experiences of our time. Many people report feeling bored almost constantly, even when they have access to more entertainment options than any previous generation could have imagined. The reason lies in how chronic overstimulation changes the brain's sensitivity to reward. When your nervous system is repeatedly exposed to high-intensity, fast-paced stimulation, it adapts. The same activities that once felt engaging now require more intensity to produce the same effect. A walk in the park or an unhurried conversation begins to feel slow and unsatisfying because your baseline expectation for stimulation has risen. Ordinary life starts to feel dull not because it has changed, but because your capacity to find richness in slower experiences has been diminished. The growing need for stronger and stronger rewards creates a quiet escalation. What once held your attention for an hour now feels insufficient after 20 minutes. The result is a cycle in which you consume more while enjoying it less, all while the deeper satisfactions that require patience and presence become harder to access. This same dynamic helps explain the death of deep focus that so many people experience. Constant stimulation does not merely distract you. It fragments the very architecture of attention. Every notification, every quick switch between tabs or apps trains your brain to operate in a state of divided awareness. The cost appears when you try to return to a single task that requires sustained concentration. your mind has grown accustomed to novelty and movement. So the stillness required for deep work feels uncomfortable, almost like an itch that needs scratching. Dopamine plays a central role here. It is involved not only in pleasure, but in the sustained motivation to stay with a goal when immediate rewards are absent. When the brain has been trained to expect frequent, low-effort rewards, the longer arc of concentration required to finish meaningful work becomes harder to maintain. Completing tasks starts to feel disproportionately difficult, not because the tasks themselves have grown harder, but because the mental environment has changed. You may recognize some of the hidden symptoms of this overload in your own life. Chronic procrastination often appears when the immediate pull of digital stimulation feels more compelling than the delayed satisfaction of starting a demanding project. Mental fatigue settles in even on days that did not involve heavy physical or cognitive labor, because the brain has been performing constant micro-decisions about what to attend to next. Brain fog makes clear thinking feel elusive, as if your mind is moving through a slight haze. Motivation for activities that once felt natural begins to fade, replaced by a vague sense that nothing quite hits the way it used to. Emotional instability can emerge in the form of irritability when stimulation is removed or when small frustrations arise because the nervous system has grown used to higher levels of external input. These symptoms are not signs of personal weakness. They are signals that your brain's reward and attention systems are operating under conditions they were not designed to handle indefinitely. There's also a dangerous illusion of productivity that often accompanies these patterns. You may feel busy throughout the day, moving between messages, updates, and quick tasks. Yet at the end of the week, you struggle to point to substantial progress on the things that matter most. Digital distractions have a way of disguising themselves as work. Responding to every notification can feel responsible and engaged, but it often replaces the slower, more valuable work of thinking deeply, planning strategically, or creating something that requires uninterrupted time. The activity feels productive because it generates visible output, replies sent, items checked off. Yet the deeper progress that compounds over months and years suffers. Mistaking this kind of activity for real advancement is one of the quiet costs of living inside an environment that constantly rewards responsiveness over depth. The price paid every day accumulates in ways that are easy to overlook until you pause to look back. Opportunities for skill development, meaningful relationships, and creative projects slip away not because you chose to ignore them, but because the immediate environment made other choices feel more natural. Discipline weakens each time an impulse is followed without resistance, not through dramatic failure, but through small, repeated concessions. Creativity suffers when the mind is rarely given the space to wander without external input, because many of the most valuable ideas emerge from periods of quiet incubation rather than constant consumption. Over time, a life controlled more by impulses than by deliberate intention begins to feel like the only available option. The cumulative effect is not just lost hours. It is a gradual shift in who you become and what you are capable of sustaining. At some point, the patterns become difficult to ignore. The wake-up call often arrives not as a dramatic crisis, but as a quiet moment of recognition. You might look at an evening that disappeared into scrolling and feel a subtle but unmistakable sense that the time was not truly yours. Or you notice that the activities you once turned to for restoration now leave you more depleted. Recognizing the problem is the first movement toward change. Accepting responsibility does not mean blaming yourself for responding to an environment designed to capture attention. It means acknowledging that while the systems are powerful, your responses are still within your influence. The first step toward freedom is simply seeing the mechanism clearly without judgment or overwhelm, and deciding that you are willing to understand it more deeply. That willingness is what allows everything that follows to take root. Having mapped the landscape of this challenge and seen its costs in daily life, we now turn to the biological machinery that makes these patterns possible. To move forward with clarity, we must understand dopamine itself, separating the myths that surround it from the more precise picture of how it actually functions in the brain. Dopamine is often described in popular conversation as the pleasure molecule, the chemical that creates feelings of enjoyment and satisfaction. The reality is more interesting and more useful. Dopamine is primarily involved in motivation, anticipation, and learning. It drives the seeking behavior that leads you toward potential rewards rather than the experience of pleasure itself. When dopamine is released, you feel a sense of wanting, of being pulled toward something. The actual enjoyment of a reward involves other systems in the brain. This distinction matters because it explains why you can chase something intensely and then feel strangely empty once you have it. The molecule that got you moving is not the same one that delivers lasting satisfaction. Understanding this helps explain why constant digital stimulation can leave you craving more even after hours of consumption. You have been feeding the seeking system without necessarily nourishing the deeper needs that create genuine fulfillment. The brain's reward prediction system offers an even clearer window into how these patterns form. Your brain is constantly making predictions about what rewards are likely to arrive and when. When a cue appears, a notification sound, the opening of an app, the beginning of a video, dopamine is released in anticipation. If the actual reward matches or exceeds the prediction, the brain updates its model and strengthens the association between the cue and the behavior. If the reward falls short, the brain also learns, though the emotional experience feels different. What is remarkable is that the anticipation itself often produces more dopamine than the reward. This is why the moment before you open the app or check the notification can feel charged with possibility, while the actual content sometimes feels anticlimactic. The science of craving is rooted in this predictive machinery. Craving is not simply desire. It is your brain's way of signaling that a particular action has been associated with reward in the past and should be repeated. When the environment is filled with cues that reliably trigger the system, craving becomes a near-constant background state rather than an occasional experience. This is how the brain gets hijacked. The process begins with a simple feedback loop. An external cue, such as a phone notification or the presence of an app icon, triggers a small release of dopamine. You act on the urge by opening the app or checking the message. A reward of some kind arrives, variable in its timing and intensity. The brain registers the sequence and strengthens the connection between the cue and the behavior. Over repeated cycles, the habit becomes more automatic, moving from conscious choice to something closer to a reflex. Addiction, in this context, rewires decision-making by strengthening the pathways that lead from cue to action, while weakening the pause that would normally allow the prefrontal cortex to evaluate whether the action aligns with longer-term intentions. The behavior does not feel like a dramatic loss of control. It feels like the natural thing to do in that moment. That is precisely what makes the pattern so persistent and so difficult to notice until the costs become visible. One of the most powerful elements in this hijacking process is the use of variable rewards. When rewards arrive on an unpredictable schedule, the brain remains engaged for longer. This is the same principle that makes slot machines compelling. You never know exactly when the next win will arrive, so you keep playing. Digital platforms have applied this principle with remarkable sophistication. Notifications do not arrive at fixed intervals. Likes, Comments and messages appear in patterns that are difficult to predict. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the hook. You check not only because you want to see what is there, but because part of your brain is trying to resolve the uncertainty. The psychology of notifications and likes exploits this same mechanism. Each one carries the possibility of social validation or important information delivered in a way that keeps the prediction system active. This is why digital platforms often resemble gambling systems more than traditional media. The design is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate choices to maximize engagement by leveraging one of the brain's most fundamental learning mechanisms. When this system operates in an environment of abundant, high-intensity stimulation, motivation for other activities can begin to disappear. Dopamine imbalance does not always mean a simple shortage of the chemical. It can also mean that the system has been recalibrated so that only certain kinds of rewards register as meaningful. Everyday tasks that once carried their own quiet satisfaction now compete with supernormal stimuli that have been engineered to trigger stronger responses. The result is a loss of drive that can feel like motivational burnout. You may want to engage in meaningful work or relationships, yet the energy and focus required feel harder to access. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable consequence of a reward system that has been shaped by an environment rich in artificial, immediate, and variable stimulation. The tension between short-term pleasure and longer-term purpose becomes especially clear in this context. The rewards offered by digital platforms are real in the moment. They provide stimulation, novelty, and social feedback, yet they are often followed by a subtle sense of depletion or guilt, and they rarely contribute to the deeper satisfactions that accumulate over time. Purposeful activities, by contrast, tend to require effort and patience. The rewards they offer, mastery, connection, contribution, arrive more slowly and require sustained attention. Discipline feels difficult not because you lack the capacity for it, but because your brain has been trained to prefer the path of least resistance and most immediate reward. The encouraging truth is that the brain can be retrained by repeatedly choosing activities that align with longer-term values. Even when they feel less immediately compelling, you gradually shift what the reward system registers as worthwhile. The process is not about forcing yourself through sheer willpower. It is about creating conditions in which meaningful goals can once again compete with the engineered alternatives. This same dynamic plays out across many areas of daily life, creating what we might call the dopamine trap. Social media addiction, for example, often begins with a genuine desire for connection and expression. Elena, a freelance photographer in her late 20s, began sharing her work online as a way to find community with other artists. At first, the likes and comments felt like authentic appreciation. Over time, however, the variable nature of the feedback began to shape her creative process. She found herself wondering not only whether a photograph was good, but whether it would perform well in the algorithm. Evenings that had once been spent experimenting with new techniques became partly occupied by checking engagement metrics and comparing her results to others. The high of a well-received post was real, but it was unpredictable, and the low of a post that received little attention felt disproportionately discouraging. The trap was not that social media had no value. It was that the platform's design had gradually shifted her relationship to her own work from intrinsic satisfaction to external validation delivered on an unpredictable schedule. Video content addiction follows a similar pattern. The recommendation systems on major platforms are engineered to keep you watching by predicting what will hold your attention next. Each video ends with cues that encourage you to continue, and the algorithm adjusts in real time based on your behavior. The experience of losing an evening to just one more video is not a sign of weak self-control. It is the result of a system that has removed most of the natural stopping points that once existed in older forms of media. Mobile gaming addiction often incorporates even more explicit, variable reward structures, including loot boxes, daily login rewards, and competitive rankings that deliver unpredictable feedback. Shopping and broader consumer patterns can operate on the same principle. The anticipation of a purchase, the browsing, the adding to cart, the tracking of a package, each stage can trigger small dopamine responses, while the actual possession of the item often produces less satisfaction than expected once the anticipation is past. These traps are not isolated. They are variations on the same underlying mechanism playing out across different domains of modern life. Understanding how to respond requires looking at the neuroscience of self-control. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most involved in planning, decision-making, and inhibiting impulses, is remarkably capable, but also resource-intensive. When your reward system is being constantly activated by digital stimuli, the balance between impulsive and reflective processes can shift. The pathways that lead to quick, automatic responses become stronger through repetition, while the capacity to pause and choose deliberately can feel weaker, especially when you are tired or already overstimulated. Willpower is not an unlimited resource that simply depletes over the course of a day. It is also a skill that can be strengthened or undermined by the environment you inhabit and the habits you practice. Building stronger mental discipline, therefore, involves both reducing the external pulls that overwhelm your reflective capacities and deliberately practicing small acts of resistance. Each time you notice an urge and choose to wait before acting on it, you are reinforcing the pathways that support intentional choice over automatic response. Taking back control begins with understanding your personal triggers. These are the specific situations, emotions, or cues that most reliably lead you toward distraction. For some people, the trigger is boredom during transitions between tasks. For others, it is stress after difficult interactions, or the simple presence of a phone within easy reach. Once you can name your most common triggers, you can begin to work with them consciously rather than being surprised by them repeatedly. Becoming conscious of your habits means observing the sequence without immediate self-criticism. You notice the cue, the urge that follows, the behavior, and the consequence. This awareness itself begins to create space between stimulus and response. With that space, you can prepare for a complete dopamine reset, a deliberate period of reduced artificial stimulation that allows your brain's reward system to recalibrate. The reset is not about eliminating all pleasure or living in deprivation. It is about giving your mind the opportunity to rediscover the satisfaction available in slower, more effortful, and ultimately more meaningful activities. When the constant high-intensity stimulation is reduced, ordinary experiences often begin to feel richer again. Motivation for longer-term goals becomes more accessible. The capacity for deep focus returns not as a forced state, but as a natural response to an environment that no longer constantly interrupts it. Throughout this journey, you have moved from recognizing the invisible architecture of distraction that surrounds you to understanding the precise biological mechanisms that these environments exploit, to seeing how these dynamics shape the ordinary moments of your days. You now carry a clearer map of both the challenge and the path toward reclaiming your attention and your sense of agency. The powerful insight to carry forward is this: your brain is not broken or deficient. It is responding with remarkable intelligence to the environment you have placed it in. By changing that environment and your relationship to it, you change what your brain learns to value and pursue. The deepest fulfillment does not come from optimizing your consumption of stimulation. It comes from building a life in which your attention serves purposes you have chosen rather than purposes that have been chosen for you. Take a moment now to reflect on what you have heard. Which patterns felt most familiar in your own experience? Which stories echoed moments you have lived? What small shift in awareness feels most relevant or most hopeful to you right now? If this exploration has given you new language for experiences you had not quite been able to name, and if it has left you with a clearer sense of what is possible, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing so you never miss another audiobook that dives deeply into psychology and personal growth, and sharing the content with others who might benefit from these ideas. Your engagement helps make it possible to continue creating thoughtful, research-informed journeys like this one. I look forward to meeting you again in our next life-changing book, where we will explore another frontier of the mind and the path toward a more intentional life. Thank you for listening with such presence. Until we meet again, may you find moments of genuine stillness in your days, and may your attention return again and again to what matters most.